This week we'll be considering chapters 4, 5, 6, and 7 of Haridas Chaudhuri's Prophet of Life Divine. These chapters take us into the specifics of the integral yoga. The chapters are about the principles of the integral yoga 1 and 2, the philosophy of the integral yoga, and on the Superman. At the outset, it needs to be reiterated that our consideration of the integral yoga of Sri Aurobindo has to be seen in our time and place. In this sense, we are looking at two iterations or versions or interpretations of Sri Aurobindo's integral yoga. Firstly, what he himself wrote between 1914 and 1920 and practiced for the rest of his life in Pondicherry. And then, as Haridas Chaudhuri teaches it to us or interprets it for us in the 1960s in the context of San Francisco of that time and of the founding of the California Institute of Integral Studies. Today, we have to consider it in the light of our own needs and necessities. This, in fact, is Sri Aurobindo's own method of interpreting the texts of the past. If we see his interpretations of the Rig Veda, the Bhagavad Gita, or the Upanishads, he makes it very clear that our hermeneutics, our interpretations, have to look into the text from the viewpoint of the needs of our consciousness in our own times. At the same time, we need to understand that there are elements that lend themselves to time and circumstance and elements that are of a more permanent nature. I would say that to understand the integral yoga in our time and place, we still need to understand it in terms of imperatives, principles, priorities, and options. The imperative of the integral yoga is its goal of becoming. Its goal of becoming, in a nutshell, can be called integral consciousness, or in Sri Aurobindo's words, supermind. How do we attain an integral consciousness? This is the goal that defines the integral yoga. The next important fundamental to the integral yoga are its philosophical principles, which is one of the chapters that we are considering. The philosophical principles of the integral yoga are its metaphysics, which in this case is constituted by the ideas of involution, evolution, and transformation. The priorities of the integral yoga are, as we will see when we enter into Haridas Chaudhuri's chapters, aspiration and grace leading to transformation. And the options of the integral yoga that can be adapted according to individual need and the exigencies of time and space are its methods. So in Sri Aurobindo's own words, as he says it in the Synthesis of Yoga, the methods have to be open and something that we experiment with. Once we know the goal of becoming, the principles of the integral yoga, and its priorities. I'm going to quote Sri Aurobindo on this notion of methods. Sri Aurobindo says, an integral and synthetic yoga needs specially not to be bound by any written or traditional shastra. For while it embraces the knowledge received from the past, it seeks to organize it anew for the present and the future. an absolute liberty of experience, and the restatement of knowledge in new terms and new combinations is the condition of its self-formation. By this yoga, we not only seek the infinite, but we call upon the infinite to unfold himself in human life. Therefore, the Shastra of our yoga must provide for an infinite liberty in the receptive human soul. A free adaptability in the manner and type of the individual's acceptance of the universal and transcendent into himself is the right condition for the full spiritual life in man. Vivekananda, pointing out that the unity of all religions must necessarily express itself by an increasing richness of variety in its forms, said once that the perfect state of that essential unity would come when each man had his own religion, when not bound by sect or traditional form, he followed the free self-adaptation of his nature in its relations with the Supreme. So also, one may say that the perfection of the integral yoga will come when each man is able to follow his own path of yoga, pursuing the development of his own nature in its upsurging towards that which transcends the nature. For freedom is the final law and the last consummation." Unquote. So, in looking at the integral yoga and its versions and reinterpretations, we have to consider these goals, these principles of the metaphysics and the priorities before we look at adapting the methods. When we think of these texts that Haridas Chaudhuri gives us reinterpreting Sri Aurobindo, we can see to some extent how he is doing the same. He's adapting the teachings of Sri Aurobindo in subtle ways for our time and space, or rather his time and space. For example, one of the principal ideas with which Sri Aurobindo starts his work on philosophy, called the Life Divine, are what he calls the refusal of the ascetic and the rejection of the materialist. The refusal of the ascetic leads to what Haridas Chaudhuri calls illusionism. That is, the traditions, historical traditions of spirituality in the world, and particularly in India, have privileged a kind of world-negating escape and duality of what is called samsara and sannyasa. So samsara becomes the world of life as people lead it together, the mainstream social life of human beings, and sannyasa becomes a outside of that, where people seek the life of the spirit, dividing these two realms. That is something that Sri Aurobindo rejects from the very beginning. The second is the refusal of the denial of the materialist. And by denial of the materialist, he is referring to modernity and the fact that we've entered into a world which is not merely of the West, but the whole world, a chapter in world history where we consider the norm of human self-definition to be a physical and material self-definition. Our physics is a physics of matter, and our biology is a biology of the physical body. Everything else, consciousness, mind, etc., are considered epiphenomena of the material, of matter, of material principle. So these are the two bounding parameters with which Sri Aurobindo begins the Life Divine, rejecting the exclusivity of both and trying to find a way by which the two interact to bring about a complete integral consciousness. Now, we have to understand that he's not looking at these as two separate principles. He's Sri Aurobindo's teaching is a teaching of non-dualism, but it's not a non-dualism that rejects matter in finding the spirit everywhere, nor is it the opposite. It is not even that spirit is in matter and matter is in spirit. We have to see the absolute monism of the two. Matter is spirit, and spirit is matter, in the sense that spirit has substantiality. The substantiality of spirit has different degrees, one may say, of degrees of concentration or degrees of compression, and its most condensed form is matter. So we have a continuum, as it were, and that is how Sri Aurobindo is talking about the release of the more free elements of consciousness in matter, which constitute its spiritual evolution. Now, when Haridas Chaudhuri is looking at this, he takes some historical aspect of Sri Aurobindo's own interpretation and understanding of spirit and matter and brings it into a formulation that relates to East and West. So we find that particularly in Haridas Chaudhuri's time, there is a sense that the world has been divided into two kinds of approaches to life. One is the Western approach, which is more materialistic, and the other is the Eastern approach, which is more spiritual. So we find a little bit of this in Haridas Chaudhuri's dealings with the same two categories of spirit and matter. They are not entirely exclusivistic. But today, when we look back at this understanding of East and West in terms of spirituality and materialism, we tend to think of it as an essentialistic interpretation. In Haridas Chaudhuri's thought, they are not essentialistic. But at the same time, this dialogue between East and West as a dialogue between the material and the spiritual life constitutes some of the disciplinary choices of CIIS. For example, East-West psychology. East-West psychology begins with this premise. Now, today, when we think about it, there has been some more understanding about these relations. Today, we talk not merely about East and West, we also talk about North and South. And in these categories, we are not looking at essentialisms of spirit and matter, but we are looking more primarily at colonization, at the fact that a certain historical change in a certain part of the world, in Europe, has expanded. It's a form of expansionism, ideological expansionism, through colonization that has dominated and suppressed other views of reality and of the human. Not only the human, but all of life and all of matter. All of that has got other premises of understanding that have been dominated and overridden, overdetermined by a materialism. So today, when we think about the same categories, we have to think about it in terms of a dialogue and engagement and an activism, that we are engaged in a post-secular dialogue of reclaiming other views of reality. And we have to connect with various forms of this particular critique and dialogue that are going on in the world today. For example, there is the entire field of what is called new materialism. New materialism does not accept matter to be a defined kind of set of properties by which we understand reality, but something mysterious. Matter itself contains an open-ended understanding that involves or includes what we call spiritual. It goes back to thinkers like Spinoza, for example, who were talking about a non-dual monism of mind and life and matter. So in any case, these are ways by which we need to rethink our understandings of the dualities of our time. There is also other things that have come since Haridas Chaudhuri's time. For example, the notion of the new age and the idea of spiritual bypassing. Sri Aurobindo is already addressing this because the whole notion of illusionism and of a world that is left as it is distasteful to him. We then have in our times other imperatives that have arisen. The imperatives of the Anthropocene, for example. Imperatives of the Anthropocene bring us the imperatives of healing the rift with the geosphere, the biosphere, and the psychosphere, the world of culture, of religion, and of diversity of these ideological views that we are talking about. Moreover, the Anthropocene has spread over the world in such a way that we do not have today the luxury of individual choice outside of the determining conditions of the world. We cannot look at these texts in some cabin in the mountain or in some ashram that is immune from all the pressures of the world, because in some way or form these spaces are also determined by the Anthropocene and its neo-colonial capitalistic ontology. So under those conditions, what is the nature of our relationship with these texts? Sri Aurobindo himself is very clear about the fact that yogas which privilege, for example, the form of a introspection that cuts us out of the world of work and action in the world is not something that can take a priority in the integral yoga. Though he does not hold or reject that form of approach for those who want to practice it or who find that they have the ability to enter into such forms of seclusion. They are not the single way, as it were, in his case. So these are some of the ways we can think of others. There is the individual nature as well, in which we need to be attentive when we understand the area of methods in the integral yoga. There is then the question of the philosophical basis of the integral yoga. That constitutes chapter 9, and we'll get to that in a moment. But behind the idea of the philosophical basis is the goal of the integral yoga. So the goal of the integral yoga, as I said, is the attainment of supermind or of an integral consciousness. These are synonyms. The supermind is the integral consciousness. And this constitutes our first understanding of the word integral as far as Sri Aurobindo is concerned. What is it? And why is it important to Sri Aurobindo? To consider this, I'd like to read a letter that Sri Aurobindo wrote to his younger brother Barin in 1920. And from that, we can develop this idea in terms again of thoughts and concepts that have intervened since the time of Haridas Chaudhuri, in fact. In this letter, the excerpt that I'm trying to read, Sri Aurobindo says about the integral, he's trying to explain what is the kind of spiritual practice that he's engaged in. He says, I can only say that its root principle is to make a harmony and unity of complete knowledge, complete works, and complete devotion, to raise all this above the mind and give it its complete perfection on the supramental level of vijnana or gnosis. This was the defect of the old yoga. The mind and the spirit it knew, and it was satisfied with the experience of the spirit in the mind. But the mind can grasp only the divided and partial. It cannot wholly seize the infinite and indivisible. The mind's means to reach the infinite are sannyasa or renunciation, moksha, liberation, and nirvana, and it has no others. One man or another may indeed attain this featureless moksha, but what is the gain? The Brahman, the Self, God are ever present. What God wants in man is to embody himself here in the individual and in the community to realize God in life. The old way of yoga failed to bring about the harmony or unity of spirit and life. It instead dismissed the world as Maya or a transient play. The result has been loss of life power and the degeneration of India. As was said in the Gita, these peoples would perish if I do not do works. These people of India have truly gone down to ruin. A few sannyasis or vairagis to be saintly and perfect and liberated, a few bhaktas to dance in mad ecstasy of love and sweet emotion and ananda, and a whole race to become lifeless, void of intelligence, sunk in deep inertia. Is this the effect of spirituality? No, we must first attain all the partial experiences possible on the mental level, but afterwards we must rise above. If we cannot rise above to the supramental level, that is, it is hardly possible to know the world's final secret, and the problem it raises remains unsolved. Unquote. So we find a few things in this quote, this longish quote. One is that he is saying that our spiritual attainments of the past have been in and through the mind. Now, this seems to be, in a way, a little paradoxical, because if we are saying that spirit is something transcendent of the mind, what does it mean to say that our approaches towards the spirit and experiences of the spirit have been experiences in mind? Here we have to think about the primary properties of mind. Primary properties of mind are encapsulated in the laws of logic. We find that mind divides and takes a stance in a particular principle or some entity and makes that into its vantage point of truth. Whatever it is, whatever it identifies with, is the primary truth, and everything else is seen as not that. This is the law of contradiction. That which is not what you take yourself to be is not true. If A is true, not A cannot be true. Secondly, there is the law of contradiction, the law of exclusion, and the law. First is the law of identity. This is what I was talking about. And the second is implicated in it, which is the law of contradiction. And the third is the law of the excluded middle. That is, in these rejections, there is nothing in between. There cannot be anything in between. We have discrete realities, one of which is real and the other is subordinate or unreal. So these laws of the mind have created all our spiritual paths. This has led today to the idea of pluralism or of some kind of exclusive monism. So we have, if we look at our times, so many different spiritual paths, not only just in any one particular culture, but throughout the world, we have innumerable spiritual paths, and we have spiritual experiences and realizations related to that path. Now, this has raised a question in religious studies. This is the question of perennialism and pluralism. The idea of perennialism says that all these paths and all these experiences are talking about their paths and experiences in different ways, but they're ultimately the same. They go to the same experience. This leads to the image of either many rivers ending up in the ocean or many paths climbing up a mountain to the mountaintop. The ocean is the same and the mountaintop is the same. So this is the notion of perennialism, which was very popular even at the time of Haridas Chaudhuri, but he is nuancing this idea. He is making it very clear that that is not what's being talked about. Just as in this quote from Sri Aurobindo, he's saying that that is the best we have achieved. Many different paths leading to the spirit, but each one its own kind. So the other way of thinking about it is pluralism. That is more the angle that Sri Aurobindo is taking. That each of our approaches to the divine, to the spirit, has been exclusive, and it has given us a experience that is different. So we have radical differences in our spiritual descriptions and experiences in the world. The question is, so is there one spirit or many? So this problem of perennialism and pluralism is an important dilemma of our time. Here in CIIS itself, there has been an approach towards an answer to this dilemma. And that approach has been presented by people like Jorge Ferrer and Jake Sherman in the book called The Participatory Turn. In the participatory turn, actually, the idea is going back to Rick Tarnas to some extent, the notion of the participatory turn. These scholars are saying, in fact, Jorge Ferrer re-images this idea of many paths to the same mountaintop or many rivers going to the same ocean. He re-images it in terms of many voyagers on the ocean going to different points of land in the extended infinite land mass that they encounter. So if we think about it in those terms, we find that each ship that arrives at a certain point on the land encounters a different terrain. And it builds a phenomenological reality through its relationship with that terrain. That becomes its description of the entire landmass. In other words, it is experiencing in a participatory way a name and form of God. And there are infinite such names and forms. And this allows us to respect our plural relations with the one, and at the same time, accept the fact that these are names and forms of the one. Now, this approach is closer to what we are talking about, but at the same time, it exacerbates pluralism, and it falls prey to the same idea of an experience in and through the mind. That these are all different experiences we can have given what we are and as we are right now. To take this a little further, I would like to draw on a parable by Sri Ramakrishna. Now, there are 2 or 3 images that are of a slightly different kind, and this is one of them. I can mention the others as well, but here is one of the parables. I raised this parable also because in the Principles of Integral Yoga in Haridas Chaudhuri's chapter 4, he starts by talking about Sri Ramakrishna. And there he's saying that Sri Ramakrishna reconciles many different spiritual paths in himself. In other words, one person can have many different spiritual experiences. Note that the quote that I just gave from Sri Aurobindo is actually affirming that, is recommending that. He's saying we must first have many different experiences of the divine and then rise beyond, rise above. So what does that mean? That is exactly what my parable, which is Ramakrishna's parable, is designed to address. So one of the parables of Sri Ramakrishna, who also used the word Vijnana in the same way as Sri Aurobindo uses it to mean supermind, he gives us this parable, the parable of the chameleon. There is a person who, in walking home, sees a chameleon on a tree. He has never seen a chameleon. When he goes home, he says, I've seen a strange animal on the tree. It is brown in color. Now, his friend who is at his home says, after listening to all his descriptions, I've seen that same animal on that tree, but it is blue in color. So then they almost get into a fist fight, arguing about the color of the animal. And finally they say, okay, let's go there and see for ourselves. Two sets of eyes can't be mistaken. And they do travel to the tree and find that it is a third color. It is green in color. So now they're wondering whether they are seeing the same animal or whether there's a variety of animals there. We can see the parallels of what we are discussing with regard to pluralism and perennialism. Now, once they are get to the point of they are confused about whether it's one or several animals, a person comes and sits down under the tree and he says, I surmise that you are arguing about the color of that chameleon. I have been living under this tree for 30 years. And I can tell you there is only one chameleon there, but it changes its colors. It has many colors and it keeps changing its colors. So Ramakrishna's parable ends here with open questions in it. Now, as far as we are concerned, we can see the problem of pluralism and perennialism or monism in this problem, in this parable. But if we think about the positionalities, we can see that the first two people, the person who went home and who was arguing with the other person, represent the mind that has many different approaches. And as we see today in the world, we are fighting about the benefits or the truth of different approaches to our different experiences of the spirit. The person who has sat under the tree and has seen the chameleon for many years is like the person that Sri Aurobindo is talking about has had many experiences. That person knows that the divine can be experienced in many ways. Ramakrishna himself is an example of that, as Haridas Chaudhuri is pointing out over here, that we are encountering a divine whose self-experiences cannot be exhausted. This is also like the many voyagers who arrive at different shores of an extended landmass. But there is one more position. That is the position of the chameleon itself. The position of the chameleon is that it carries the radical infinity of its colors within itself. All that it has ever expressed do not exhaust what it can become. And only it knows its own radical infinity. Others can only see the possibility of what it has expressed so far as a bounded infinite. It in itself is an unbounded or radical infinite. So Sri Aurobindo's rising above that he's referring to here is to move from the positionality of the person under the tree to the positionality of the chameleon itself. That is the supermind. And there we find that there is a paradoxical reality that supersedes the logic of the mind, because it can be one and infinite at the same time. It can be perennial and plural at the same time. It is not a plurality that is cancelled by becoming perennial, just like the rivers are cancelled by becoming the ocean, or the paths are cancelled by becoming the mountaintop. Here, each path exists in its fullness and in its complete self-definition as the whole, not only as part of the whole, but as the whole, along with every other self-definition of the whole, radical infinite self-definitions of the whole that have come into existence and that have never and will never fully exhaust the infinity of that one. To be that, to be the subject with everything else as its objects, that is the integral consciousness or the supermind according to Sri Aurobindo. This brings us to the notion of the metaphysics of the integral yoga. Oh, how does this relate to the idea of the integral yoga? Haridas Chaudhuri's chapter 6, I believe, chapter 6 deals with the philosophy of the integral yoga, but this chapter is a short chapter, but still extremely concise and gives us the essence of this philosophy or metaphysics of the supermind and of reality itself. It's the philosophical basis of integral yoga. One thing to note here is that Haridas Chaudhuri coins a few terms. They're very important terms. He gives a name to Sri Aurobindo's yoga. He calls it integral non-dualism, and in Sanskrit, Purnadvaita Vedanta. For those who are familiar with the schools of Vedanta in the Upanishads, they would understand that this is a positioning, a creative positioning of the field of interpreting the Upanishads that Haridas Chaudhuri is conducting through this particular interpretation of the integral yoga. What are the primary features of this philosophy? The primary features have to do with the notion of involution and evolution. In other words, Sri Aurobindo's understanding of it in terms of the Veda goes back to what he calls the sacrifice of Purusha. Without going into the mythological details of that, the idea of sacrifice of the Purusha is that there is a consciousness of the absolute infinite which can divide the one and the many, what we just spoke about. We spoke about the fact that the one can have infinite self-descriptions. But to see these self-descriptions as exclusive and separate, you need a certain kind of organ of self-perception, as it were. This organ is cosmic mind, just as we discussed. It is the mind that can create discrete realities. So the infinite possibilities of the one can each be a stand in which the infinite takes itself, causing a kind of diversification or pluralization of its self-descriptions. This faculty by which this is done must be a kind of cosmic mind, just like we use our mind to create these classifications that are exclusive of each other. This is what Sri Aurobindo and Haridas Chaudhuri following him calls overmind. So overmind takes the infinite one and divides it. But this division must actually be an operation within a reality that has already differentiated itself. So when we are saying that there can be infinite self-descriptions of the one, we mean that there is a certain way by which the one can form self-descriptions of itself. This is supermind. This is the reason why when we rise above the mind and its exclusive realizations of the one, we come to a reality that is infinitely one, self-differentiated into its infinite self-descriptions, and at the same time not self-divided into exclusivities. That is the supermind. So this overmind and supermind form two different kinds of self-experiences of the one that's differentiating itself. This self-differentiation also causes a certain kind of gradation of self-experience. And this is the self-experience we were talking about when I referred to the fact that spirit and matter are the same, but they are different degrees of self-concentration. Spirit is substantiality, the substantiality of spirit that has concentrated itself into a shell or something like an object of itself, an object form of itself, is matter. But matter becomes spirit, as it were, locked into its own exclusive reality due to the operation of the cosmic mind or overmind that gives it a separate reality, a discrete reality. But in that discrete reality, all of spirit is present, is contained, and it evolves through a relationship with that which it is. So this is the relationship between the involution, that is the way by which spirit in its most dense form becomes an exclusive reality, that is the involution, and its relationship with what it is unfolding in time as an evolution. This evolution creates emergent properties of consciousness. So from a condition where all of consciousness is latent, lost, oblivious as matter, we start having the properties of life, where there's some sentience. Consciousness has expressed itself in a certain range of self-experience. Behind it again is all of reality. Life is no less spiritual than spirit or matter, and again the emergent property of mind. And in each of these cases, there are entities that embody these things, not exclusively, but as it were in an inclusive way. A living being has material reality and life reality and the latency of mind reality in it, and also the latency of supermind or integral consciousness in it. Similarly, the human being has all of matter, life, and mind in it, as well as the integral consciousness in it, but that is a latency. This entire system is something which is evolving and has a pressure towards evolving its latent properties. And in the human, it is these properties and this pressure, as it were, that become individualized as what Sri Aurobindo calls the psychic being. And that is what leads it towards aspiration, an individual form of aspiration, each one of us unique form of aspiration towards unfolding the latent possibilities that are in us. This, in a sense, in a nutshell, is the philosophical basis of integral yoga. Now, in the chapter's main principles of integral yoga, Haridas Chaudhuri is going to look at Sri Aurobindo's formulations of the integral yoga. And this is extremely interesting because Sri Aurobindo has a number of formulations of the integral yoga. In main principles of integral yoga 1 and 2, Haridas Chaudhuri is going to consider Sri Aurobindo's principal work, Synthesis of Yoga. Partly he's going to consider that. He's partly going to consider Sri Aurobindo's book, The Mother, and he's partly going to consider The Life Divine, because these give us different systems of methods. In the main principles of integral yoga 1, Haridas Chaudhuri considers Hatha Yoga, Raja Yoga, and he considers the triple path of the Gita. Now we find in Sri Aurobindo's quote to his brother, he is referring to the triple path of the Veda, of the Gita, the path of knowledge, works, and devotion. And he's also showing how each of these becomes an exclusive path that, in a sense, leads to a realization but cuts off the integrality of life. He privileges over here in that quote, we saw that he privileges works over the path of knowledge and devotion, but not excluding those paths. Those paths are equally important, but in a way, works cannot be the ability to work and participate in life is central to the integral yoga. And so Haridas Chaudhuri in his chapters spends special attention to that area, to karma yoga as it were. Karma yoga is our connection with the spiritual entity through works. And Haridas Chaudhuri talks about that. It's also related to our aspiration and how we become in the world in relation to our circumstances, so that we are not just doing work in the world for ourselves, but for the becoming of the divine, the growth of freedom and consciousness in the world. Then he turns to the book, The Mother. He does not explicitly say this, but if you know what he's talking about, then you see that these are the texts that he's referring to. And in the book, The Mother, he uses the term the divine Shakti over there. He hones in on a triple formula called aspiration, rejection, and surrender. Now Haridas Chaudhuri parses it slightly differently. He talks about aspiration, self-surrender, and opening to the divine. And inside the chapter inside the section on self-surrender, he refers to rejection as well. Now, what are these things? What is aspiration? Later, he has a greater exclusive treatment to aspiration. Aspiration becomes the very foundation of the integral yoga as far as Haridas Chaudhuri is concerned, the central fact. In fact, there was one disciple of Sri Aurobindo who asked him to reduce his yoga to just the most simple principles. And Sri Aurobindo said, aspiration and grace. And the other person said, does not grace follow when there is aspiration? And Sri Aurobindo answered, yes. In other words, one way of thinking about the entire yoga is that it is founded upon aspiration. Or what is aspiration? Haridas Chaudhuri makes it clear that aspiration is not ambition. Aspiration is not an individual will towards greatness, whether spiritual or material. Aspiration has to do with something which is intrinsic to the involution. In other words, what I just said about the fact that in becoming condensed matter, exclusive matter, and matter which in a sense locks spirit in itself, there is within it a pressure or a will to evolve. This will to evolve is giving us these rungs of consciousness that I mentioned, the rungs of life and mind. And in an individualized form, it is present in each of us as our deepest emotional response towards the divine. And the divine can be can be experienced by us in unique ways. What is the highest or deepest or most valued aspect that we aspire towards building a relationship with and towards coming into union with? So that becomes the notion of aspiration, and it is central to this yoga. Aspiration makes us more and more aware of the fact that what we are aspiring towards has a reality of its own, and it is outside and inside us. And as something that has potentialities, latencies beyond our ability, we build a kind of openness to it, an openness which causes a relationality to develop. and a relationality that increasingly demands of us a surrender, surrendering to the ability to receive that which is our own latent possibilities. So this surrender, it also includes a kind of intuition of rejection. What is necessary for me at this time? What enables my growth? And what is to be kept aside so that I'm not distracted or taken away from where I need to go? Here also Haridas Chaudhuri brings in two paths or two kinds of understandings of surrender. And he refers to a parable of Sri Ramakrishna again, that Sri Aurobindo himself invoked to describe what Sri Aurobindo called passive surrender and active surrender. Passive surrender is a kind of an attitude where we just put ourselves like a kind of a, inert stone in front of the divine and say, you do with me what you will. Sri Aurobindo does not favor that approach, because he says that is an inertial surrender where you're open to all kinds of forces in the name of the divine, or in the name of the higher principle with which you need to build an active relationship. So there are two types. At the same time, this active relationship becomes more and more trusting as the relationship develops, so that there is a kind of surrender that is extremely conscious and yet totally dependent or surrendered to the higher principle. And the parable of Sri Ramakrishna related to this is that of the baby monkey and the baby cat. The baby monkey, the relationship with its mother is one in which the baby monkey has to keep up with the mother. The mother jumps from branch to branch, and the baby monkey has to learn to develop the skill to catch on to it. The mother is not going to take it unless it makes its own effort. And the baby cat, on the other hand, puts itself entirely at the disposal of its mother, who carries it by its neck wherever it has to go. So these are forms of relationship, and they have to take the form that we need at the time that we need it. So these are some of the ways in which Haridas Chaudhuri talks about the methods of integral yoga, following these texts like the synthesis of yoga and the mother. He also talks about some movements, particularly the chakras in the esoteric anatomy of Tantra, and the ascent and descent of consciousness, because Sri Aurobindo is going to make a slight difference between the tantric method where consciousness rises from the kundalini and travels up the chakras to the thousand-petaled lotus. Here, the surrender to the Divine Mother or the Divine Shakti above the mind in the supermind causes a progressive opening of the various chakras from the mind to the center of the spine, below this at the base of the spine. This is not necessarily a kind of hierarchism that follows from above below or from below above. Any center, depending on one's own natural makeup, constitution, can be more receptive and can open up more to start with. But the real point that Sri Aurobindo is making and Haridas Chaudhuri is making is that all of them at some point need to open up. And the reliance over here is to a gradual descent of consciousness that is going to make possible the opening up in a gradual way of all the centers of consciousness. Haridas Chaudhuri also relates the practice of the integral yoga to life pursuits, the actual things we do in our everyday life. For example, cultural pursuits or humanitarianism. And then he has a section on psychology. He makes it clear that the ideal of humanitarianism is not the same as what we are talking about here. And here one has to relate what Haridas Chaudhuri is saying again to things that have arisen after him. For example, the notion of post-humanism. Humanitarianism keeps us locked in a certain definition of the human. Integral yoga is about becoming what we are not, what we are yet to unfold in terms of a law beyond the law of mind or logic. And so humanitarianism, whereas being good to other humans, helping them in their ascent, is certainly part of the yoga. Freedom of all human beings, human rights are certainly a part of the yoga. Humanitarianism as an ideology or an ideal is not the highest ideal according to integral yoga. Cultural pursuits taken in their own sense for their own sake are not the highest goal of the yoga, but all cultural pursuits, including all creative activity that connects us to our evolutionary drive and that actually empowers our aspiration and our understanding of spiritual freedom for ourselves and others, are a empowerment in this yoga. Then in the second chapter of the methods, which is chapter 5, Haridas Chaudhuri looks at the triple formula taken from the Life Divine, which is called the triple transformation. And here again we come back to aspiration, because the triple transformation, according to the Life Divine, they are psychicization, spiritualization, and supramentalization. These are three transformations. The first transformation is based again on aspiration and the coming to the front of the psychic being and transforming our nature by its power. Along with this, which is an individualization of the evolutionary drive, each one of us contains, as it were, a psychic being, which is the reincarnating element in us. Each human being is conterminous with the history of the earth. We have something in us that has been reborn again and again, and we can discover that, we can experience that in ourselves. Experiencing that is a necessity of the integral yoga, and that brings us, as it were, into contact with our psychic being that can become the principal transforming agent in our life. But at the same time, its individuation has to be related to a universalization, a relationship with others in which true understanding can occur at the universal plane. That universalization or spiritualization is a simultaneous and successive transformation. And then finally, that will lead us to the conditions under which supramentalization, or what Sri Aurobindo called going above, can take place. The section on psychology or libido in Haridas Chaudhuri's dealing with the integral yoga is very important, very interesting, because there he shows how libido itself is a very powerful drive that becomes transformed, not only sublimated but transformed in the integral yoga. The final chapter that we are considering, which is chapter 7, is Haridas Chaudhuri's discussion of the Superman or divine man. What is the Superman? Have there been other descriptions of the Superman? And how does Sri Aurobindo's Superman stack up with them? How does it compare to them? Firstly, Haridas Chaudhuri discusses Superman with relation to Nietzsche's idea of the Superman. Sri Aurobindo got the term Superman most likely from Nietzsche. And when we read Sri Aurobindo in depth, we find that in many places he is actually, in a sense, paraphrasing Nietzsche. His readings into Nietzsche are extensive. And one would say that if there is an influence of a Western thinker that Sri Aurobindo is conversing with, it would be Nietzsche. When Haridas Chaudhuri was writing these books, Nietzsche was still receiving a bad rap, partly because he had been appropriated by the Nazi Party, though he was completely against anti-Semitism. In other words, in fact, he rejected his deep friendship with Wagner because he found out that Wagner was an anti-Semite. But Nietzsche's sister was part of the National Socialist Party and appropriated him for the party, which caused tremendous harm to his reputation. However, we find that from about the 60s, there is a reinterpretation of Nietzsche by scholars like Karl Jaspers, Martin Heidegger, and then times closer to ours by Gilles Deleuze. And we see him in a completely different light today, in a light that's actually much closer to Sri Aurobindo than the way in which he was looked at earlier. Principally, his idea of the will to power. The will to power for Nietzsche is not the will to domination at all. The will to power is the evolutionary drive that is seeking power over limitations. The will to power in the human is the self-exceeding of the human, not the self-exceeding in terms of dominating others, but in being able to overcome our own limitations, to have power over our own limitations. Haridas Chaudhuri points out that Nietzsche's allergy to Christianity has caused him to become much more, an apostle of power. But we find, and Haridas Chaudhuri as a result says that some of Nietzsche's excesses need to be corrected by seeing that the integral yoga posits an idea of the Superman that includes both Christian love, or actually all three: Christian love, Nietzschean power, and the Greek idea of knowledge. So all these ideals are included and integrated in the integral yoga. But to some extent we can see all these three in Nietzsche himself. Nietzsche's totem that leads to the higher man and later to the Übermensch, the overman, is a composite animal that contains the camel at the bottom, the lion on top of the camel, and the child on top of the lion. From a certain point of view, these are the three gunas in Indian philosophy as talked about in the Gita. The camel may represent tamas, which forms a solid base for us, a base made up of patience, surrender, the ability to carry burdens, obedience, etc. It is necessary according to Nietzsche. On top of that, but that cannot be the higher man. On top of that is the idea of the lion. The lion can be equated with rajas, our dynamic power. The lion has got tremendous power, and that needs to be mobilized in this idea of moving to the higher man. And the child is not only is a case of sattva, which is a greater light, but a case of innocence, of spontaneity, of creativity, and of a certain perception of divinity. In the child, we also find the Christian notion, the kingdom is of the child. Christ himself is considered often to be the divine child. So it isn't that Nietzsche is rejecting the truth of Christianity. He's seeing, in fact, this hierarchy leading to the idea of the divine child. The psychic being is also figured often as the divine child immanent in all of us. Haridas Chaudhuri considers some other kinds of ideas of the Superman in his time. For example, Bernard Shaw, who wrote a book called Man and Superman, where he talks about the collective evolution of man to a Superman. But Bernard Shaw's Superman is a human hero, doesn't have powers that exceed our faculties and our powers of consciousness. So it doesn't go beyond the rational, as it were. The third person that Haridas Chaudhuri considers is Samuel Alexander, somebody not so well known today, but who was a major philosophical figure in Haridas Chaudhuri's time, and who has left us with the idea of emergentism. That is also still a very powerful idea of the emergence from matter of new forms of consciousness. Samuel Alexander predicts that rational consciousness is a stage and something greater in his book Space, Time and Deity, something more godlike, firstly more of an angelic being and then more divine being will emerge from the evolution of the human. Not the evolution, from the evolution of nature, as it were. But he doesn't see much of a continuity or a power by which the human can exceed itself, which Sri Aurobindo holds out through the integral yoga. And that's something that Haridas Chaudhuri points out. Then Haridas Chaudhuri looks at the Indian spiritual ideal of Jivan Mukti, which is liberation in life that the traditional yogas have held out. And he looks at the Superman in Sri Aurobindo as definitely a Jivan Mukta, as somebody who is liberated in life, but more than a Jivan Mukta, because having risen to a higher form of consciousness beyond whatever has been expressed so far, it uses that consciousness to transform its entire nature and create a new kind of race, one may say, a Gnostic race. Gnostic in the sense of gnosis, of Vijnana. Finally, he has a section on the avatar and Superman. In this section, of course, in Haridas Chaudhuri's time, he's looking at the avatar as a descent or incarnation of the divine. Here, in Haridas Chaudhuri's telling, he holds Sri Aurobindo to be an avatar. And he says that the supramental being is somebody who reaches up to that status. Human beings can become like the divine or one with the divine, but human beings evolve towards that condition, while the avatar is a descent. In other words, it's a new power of consciousness that is opened up in nature so that nature itself can express at that level. And that expression is the Superman. So it's in these ways that we find these 4 chapters give us an extensive view of Sri Aurobindo's integral yoga as Haridas Chaudhuri understood it and as he invites us to explore in our time and place in the ways that are necessary to us.